introduce him. I think the rest of us might want to go down so we can watch his clip. Brett Bowles is an associate professor of French studies in the Department of French and Italian at Indiana University, and also the director of the Institute for European Studies there. He has, his book Marcel Pagnol was published in 2012 by Manchester University Press. He's edited Cinema, Society, and Politics in France and Germany, 1930 to 45, and he has a manuscript under consideration called Marcel au Fus, about, I think Marcel au Fus.
Yeah, that's right. Can't get away from Marcel.
Anyway, and today he will be speaking about, it's called Between Vichy and the Germans, Marcel Pagnol and the Politics of French Cinema During the Occupation.
Thanks, Sarah. So I decided a better title for my talk would probably be something like À la recherche de Marcel Pagnol sur l'occupation, so that's what I put up on the screen there. And that's a photo of Pagnol at his writing desk in his studios in Marseille from sometime in mid-1941. So there are two distinct ways in which the history of Pagnol's activities during the occupation could be told. The first, which I'm going to use today, is explaining how and why a pillar of France's film industry accommodated both Vichy and the Germans to varying degrees, how he used accommodation to protect his own professional and financial interests, and how in so doing he became, in many ways, an unintentional mediator of ideological and economic competition between the two sides, caught in an undercurrent of compromise and conflict that often lay below the surface of state collaboration. And that's, I think, really the interest of Pagnol as a case study, to see how he draws out this dynamic of compromise and collaboration, compromise and conflict, that lay below the surface of state collaboration. So the second way to tell the story would be kind of a meta-narrative, retracing how after the war both Pagnol himself and his descendants very carefully managed information about his wartime activities through silence, half-truths, and in some cases outright lies in order to protect his reputation and to protect the ongoing commercial value of his work as a quintessential expression of Frenchness. The other part of the meta-narrative would be about access to archives, not only the Pagnol family archives, but access to public archives, and how a young cultural historian, me, in the mid-1990s came to this topic and had to deal with various types of restrictions that were placed on anything to do with post-war purge or collaboration. And those of you who work in the field know that over the past 15 years, archival access has improved substantially. So that would be another paper, and it might be interesting, but I'm going to focus on actually telling you what Pagnol was up to during the war. This was my white whale for a long time, and I think I finally figured it out. So it's, I'm happy to share it. A couple of reminders before I get into the specifics of Pagnol. Under the occupation, cinema was a crucially important industry for both economic and ideological reasons. The vehicle of economics was primarily feature films, which held a huge revenue potential in the form of box office receipts and offered very often a disproportionate return on state investment. On the other side, on the ideological side, documentaries and newsreels were the primary vehicles of ideology, and proof of this is the fact that both the Nazis in the occupied zone and the Vichy government in the unoccupied zone had their own distinct weekly newsreel series and documentary series that actually had very different sets of ideological priorities and ideological content. So that's a point that's going to come back later. It's also important to keep in mind that Pagnol was an especially attractive partner for the Germans, because outside Paris, he had the only entirely self-sufficient film studio complex and production laboratories in the unoccupied zone. Pagnol, of course, is down in Marseille. This map here just gives you an idea of film distribution during the occupation. So the dotted line is the demarcation line between the occupied north and the unoccupied south. The bold lines that you see delineate the different film distribution areas of France. All the cities listed are key cities with a population of 50,000 or more, and the cities that are in capital letters, bold, underlined, are film distribution hubs within each of the zones. So that's just to give you an idea of the geography we're talking about. And so Pagnol had the only self-contained sort of film production and printing facility outside of Paris. It was a modest facility, but it had been newly renovated in 1938 to essentially American standards. So the quality of the equipment was very high, and that immediately made him an attractive partner, not only for the Vichy government, who desperately wants to put out its own, especially newsreel and documentary series, but also for the Germans, who want to have access to essentially Marseille and the Riviera to shoot films there as well as in studios in Paris. Okay. So the starting point here for us really should be the indictment dossier against Pagnol. So he was actually indicted for collaboration. He was called before one of the purge committees. It was a purge committee in the Paris region that was delegated with adjudicating cases of suspected collaboration in the film industry. He was actually called on November 27th, 1946, and there were 3 criteria that were put forward for investigating him. The first was that he had distributed a short Vichy documentary made in the summer of 1940 called La Tragédie de Marcel Pagnol. This is a short film about the British destruction of the French Mediterranean fleet on July 3rd, 1940. Most of you know that incident, so I won't describe it any further. The second indictment criterion was the fact that he had processed in his laboratories in Marseille a documentary series called La France en Marche. This was a monthly or sometimes bi-monthly series that Vichy funded and ran with the help of the French Armistice Army Cinema Service from 1940 to 1943. The third and the most interesting criterion for his indictment was that he had incorporated the June 17th, 1940 radio broadcast by Marcel Pagnol announcing the armistice into a fiction film that he began before the war but finished after the armistice, called La Fille du Pisatier, the Well-Digger's Daughter, which turned out to be one of, if not the most lucrative French fiction film that was distributed during the occupation. So Pagnol defended himself on these counts. On the first 2, he essentially said that the Vichy government had come to him and said, we're requisitioning your personnel and your facilities and your material, and there's nothing you can do about it, and that he was not compensated for any of that work. Those were both outright lies, as archival evidence has shown me. The way he defended himself against the accusation of putting Pétain's armistice announcement in La Fille du Pisatier was he said that the Germans had objected to that part of the film when it came time to be released in the occupied zone, and they had actually banned the film and then reauthorized it only after forcing him to cut that part out. That was more of a half-truth, but it was certainly a willful distortion, as we'll see. The file, since Sandy was talking about the court files that she's looked at, the file on Pagnol is quite short. It's only 2 pages. There are no letters of support from anybody or anything else. There are no witnesses. Pagnol appears unaccompanied by any sort of legal counsel, and he just sort of defends himself, and he concludes with the phrase that since this film was banned by Vichy, banned by the Germans, he says, it's difficult for me to understand how a scene banned by the Germans can be considered collaboration. And based on his reputation, based on that, he was acquitted formally of all charges on February 3rd, 1947. Now, one of the little ironies here is that during this entire period that he himself is under indictment, Pagnol is also the head of the Société des auteurs et compositeurs dramatiques, which was founded by Beaumarchais in the 18th century, and so Pagnol himself, as the head of the SACD, was charged with adjudicating cases of suspected collaboration while he himself was under indictment. So that's one of the interesting ironies here. He was a very, very indulgent head of the SACD. He did not recommend a single person who was denounced to him that they be investigated any further. So that's also an interesting thing to talk about. I probably won't have time at the end. So what I'd like to do now is just flash back to no, not there yet, to the summer of 1940 and talk a little bit about what's going on there. So at the time that the Marcel Pagnol film is being shot, and it was shot sort of incidentally, there's a film crew from the Army on site there making a film about daily life on a battleship. The British fleet happens to appear, and they're in this perfect spot at the perfect time to get this all on film. So Vichy has this in the can, and of course, this is the best sort of propaganda footage you could possibly hope for. Very quickly, the Germans realize that the Vichy government has this, and they start asking for it. And very smartly, what Vichy administrators do is they say, well, we're going to make our own film, and we have to decide what we can do with it, and then we might give it to you, but we're going to ask for certain concessions. And one of the concessions is that the Germans drop their request to distribute Les Actualités Mondiales. This is a French-language, German-produced newsreel that's heavily pro-collaborationist, very propagandistic in nature. The Germans are distributing this in the occupied zone from August 8th, 1940 on, and they want to have free reign to distribute it in southern France as well. The Vichy government uses the Marcel Pagnol footage as a bargaining chip to essentially say no and to buy the time and space necessary to found their own newsreel series, which is called France Actualité Pâté Gaumont, and to found the second documentary series that I mentioned in which Pagnol is implicated called La France en Marche. The next point here is that I found contracts that Pagnol actually signed with Vichy's Ministry of Information, providing him with full compensation for personnel and equipment and material costs related to the Marcel Pagnol film and La France en Marche. He also was given exclusive distribution rights. He received 40% of the box office receipts, and he was also guaranteed that if the box office receipts, his percentage did not match his expenses for distribution, that the Vichy government would pay the difference. And this is an extraordinarily generous contract that shows just how much the Vichy government needed and wanted to work with him. So on that count, Pagnol was just telling outright lies at his indictment hearing. So let's now move on to La Fille du Puisatier. This is an advertising poster from the unoccupied zone. So why did Pagnol play ball with Vichy? So he didn't lose money, but he didn't make a lot of money from these documentary series. His real financial interest and investment was in finishing this film that he had begun in May 1940, only days before the German invasion. According to Pagnol, he had about 6 million francs invested in the project, and he desperately needed to recoup that money, particularly because he was going through a messy divorce and he was going to soon be required at the end of 1940 to pay a big divorce settlement. So he absolutely needed the money. You see this in letters he's writing to friends and family in different parts of France. And so essentially not complying with Vichy's request would have been a kind of professional suicide. So it's a classic example of sort of situational accommodation to preserve his own interests. So we now come to this question of the infamous sequence that Pagnol says was perceived by the Germans as being pro-resistance and that he claims was cut from the film. So this is a 3-minute sequence. I'd just like to show it. It has good French subtitles for those of you who are not entirely fluent in listening to a heavy Provençal accent. So you can just hit play. Thanks.
C'est grave, c'est pour tout le monde. Tu es venu tout à l'heure au magasin pour écouter le message du maréchal. Mais écoute, j'ai la voiture là, au bout du chemin. Je t'emmène et je te ramène. Mais aujourd'hui, ça n'a pas d'importance. Il faut que tu viennes, Pascal. Tu écoutes ce qu'il va nous dire. Les raisons de plus. Ce qu'il dira, même et surtout ce qui est terrible. Il faut que chaque Français découvre, en silence, ce qu'il apprenne en même temps que tous les corps, le malheur de la patrie. Bien, Pascal. Bien. De l'État-France, mesdames, messieurs, monsieur le Marcel Pagnol, président du Conseil des ministres, vous parle. Français, un appel de monsieur le Président de la République. J'assume, à partir d'aujourd'hui, la direction du gouvernement de la France. Sur admirable armée qui lutte avec un héroïsme digne de ses longues traditions militaires contre un ennemi supérieur en nombre et en armes. Vu que par sa magnifique résistance, elle a rempli notre devoir vis-à-vis de nos alliés. Vu de l'appui des anciens combattants que j'ai eu la fierté de commander. Vu de la confiance du peuple tout entier. Je fais à la France le don de ma personne pour atténuer son malheur. En ces heures douloureuses, je pense aux malheureux réfugiés qui, dans un dénuement extrême, sillonnent de route. Je leur exprime ma compassion et ma sollicitude. C'est le cœur serré que je vous dis aujourd'hui qu'il faut cesser le combat. Je me suis adressé cette nuit à l'adversaire pour lui demander s'il est prêt à rechercher avec moi, contre Cedar, après la lutte et dans l'honneur, les moyens de mettre un terme aux hostilités. Que tous les Français se groupent autour du gouvernement que je préside pendant ces dures épreuves et fassent taire leur angoisse pour n'obéir qu'à leur foi dans le destin de la patrie. C'est pas parce que je ne comprends pas. Je ne comprends pas.
Moi, je comprends votre petit morceau, rien. Non, madame, non. Non, ce n'est pas vrai. La France s'est battue. Mais si tous ces hommes ont fait demain, tous sans exception, s'ils revenaient vaincus, joyeux et bien portants, chantant des chansons de groupe, il n'y aurait plus de France. Et même on pourrait dire que la France n'était pas une patrie. Ils n'ont pas sauvé la France, mais ils l'ont trouvée. Les morts des batailles perdues sont la raison de vivre des vaincus.
Okay, so when he appeared before the Purge Committee, Pagnol cited this last line, which is delivered by his then companion, Josette Day, who's an absolutely terrible actress, by the way, but she's quite pretty. This idea that the dead soldiers, ils n'ont pas sauvé la France, mais ils l'ont prouvé. Les morts des batailles perdues sont les raisons de vivre des vaincus, right? And Pagnol then says in front of the Purge Committee, this is one of the lines that's transcribed, how many resistors through, combien de résistants ont lancé une telle phrase au visage des Allemands, right? So watching this as historians, right, you probably don't feel like this is much of a pro-resistance message, and indeed, we know that it's entirely consistent with the tenor of Vichy propaganda at the time, right? The cult of mourning, right, this idea of recueillement autour du maréchal. These are standard themes of Vichy propaganda in late 1940 that are hammered home over and over again. We also know from the trade press that Pagnol actually personally drove to Vichy in order to get the record from the Ministry of Information on which the speech by Pétain had been recorded. And indeed, Pagnol himself, in promoting the film, in his own fanzine that he founded in January 1941, which was called Les Cahiers du Film, used a lot of Vichy rhetoric in promoting the film, right? He calls it c'est un film qui loue l'esprit du maréchal, la valeur du retour à la terre. He talks about, and here you see it's the, I didn't transcribe that, it says it's le premier chef-d'œuvre de la France renaissante, right? So this is all very sort of, these are all Vichy taglines that we see over and over. Now the other interesting thing about this particular sequence that I showed you is Vichy liked it so much that they actually modeled the 1-year anniversary newsreel clip after this clip that Pagnol had created for his fiction film. And we don't have time to see that, but if you watch it, they use exactly the same camera work that Pagnol used, where you start with a community of different ages, different classes assembled around the radio. They play the speech that Pétain made, and then there are cutaway shots in close-ups or near shots to the different people listening reverently, right? And then they all sort of file out and hang their heads sadly. So this is very much an element of Vichy ideological discourse from late 1940. I would also say that The film was extraordinarily popular in the unoccupied zone. It broke box office records. It premiered right before Christmas 1940, and it ran for almost 9 months uninterrupted in various parts of the unoccupied zone. So when the film went to Paris, oh, I'm sorry, and that's the Pâté Palace facade from Marseille. Rému reportedly saw the facade and he said, "Ah, c'est Blanche-Neige et les deux nains." He didn't like the fact that Josette Day's head was bigger than his and Fernandel's in the billboard there. And then the film subsequently went to Paris, and it went to Paris in the context of a reciprocal exchange agreement. The Germans desperately wanted German-made films coming from Continental in Paris to be allowed in the South. By the same token, the French wanted French films being made in the South to be allowed north of the demarcation line. So Pagnol's film was allowed in the North in exchange for Vichy allowing a certain number of Continental productions to play in the South. This was the same kind of an agreement was negotiated with newsreels. So here we see the line the first day that the film played in Paris at the Madeleine. This is one of the big, it's about a 1,500-seat cinema. It's one of the exclusive cinemas in Paris. And the day before the public opening, there was a special gala screening at which high-ranking German and French officials were present, including Reich Ambassador Otto Abetz and several other prominent proponents of collaboration. Now, contrary to what Pagnol says in his post-war testimony about this sequence upsetting the Germans and they're banning the film for that reason, I found a report from the Referat Film of the Propagandaabteilung. This is the main censorship board that the Germans have, and there's a cinema unit. And in their weekly report, just prior to this in mid-April, they praise, quote, "the excellent performance of the 3 principal male actors," and concluded that, quote, "the Marshal's speech to the French on the occasion of the armistice is ingenuously used, geschickt vertweit, and will therefore elicit the same exceptional reaction in the occupied zone as it did in the unoccupied zone." So clearly, the Germans viewed this as being complementary to their own propaganda agenda. And you see this all the time in the newsreels. There's collaborationist discourse and the sort of spoonful of sugar coming into the occupied zone from Vichy about national revolution, armistice army, cult of Pétain, cult of mourning, all that stuff. It sort of makes the propaganda that the Germans are trying to feed Northern Zone spectators a little more palatable. So in that sense, this film actually worked to complement German interests rather than to contradict them. I have a long section here about the reception. The film in the occupied zone gets glowing reviews from even the most virulently collaborationist papers. Je suis partout, Le Cri de Paris, Les Nouveaux Temps. Everybody loves the film. And in fact, several of them mention the radio sequence, saying this is the best part of the film. It shows that the French can maintain their dignity, you know, in the new European order. Again, you know, code for this sort of Nazi Europe and so on. So just moving to the next sort of piece of evidence here, you're all familiar with the infamous exposition called Le Juif et la France, which opened in September of 1941 at the Palais Berlitz in Paris. And there was a special part of that exhibit devoted to cinema. And you see here one of the billboards or the poster boards inside that says Les Juifs, maîtres du cinéma français. You see the portrait of Bernard Nathan there in the middle. He was the guy who sort of ran Pathé into bankruptcy in the mid-30s, and he was sort of the Jewish scapegoat for the entire industry. So there's a juxtaposition here between Les Juifs, maîtres du cinéma français, and then Honneur aux artisans du film français. And you'll notice if you look closely that the third column from the left features La Fille du Prisatier. And what is the last image there on the right? It's hard to make out, but it's a still shot of the radio sequence that I just showed. So clearly the Germans weren't terribly upset with this. Now the other thing you'll notice is that Pagnol's film is set alongside 2 others whose names I didn't write down, I'm sorry. L'Assassinat du Père Noël and Premier Bal, which are both Continental productions, right? So clearly the Germans viewed this kind of integration as masking the fact that these are German films that are made using German money. I don't really have time to talk a whole lot about Alfred Graven, the head of Continental. He's a fascinating guy. I'm writing a long article on him with a Belgian colleague. He's the bald guy there in the middle top. And here's an even better picture of him partying with Daniel Darieux on the left, Viviane Romance on the right. You'll see Harry Bohr there is on the right as well. So what I'd like to do is just mention a couple of things in passing and then wrap up. Pagnol did a lot of stuff that wasn't in his indictment dossier either. After La Fille du Prisatier, he wanted to make a new trilogy called La Prière aux Étoiles. And in order to do that, he needed to have access to Paris. And to get to Paris, he needed German permission. So what he did was, although after the war he claimed that he consistently refused every effort Graven made to win him over, he actually rented his studios to Graven and Continental in late 1941 to make a film with Fernandel called, it's a terrible film, it's a kind of a body comedy called Le Club des Soupirants. But Pagnol then subsequently promoted the film in his Cahiers du Film journal that I just showed you earlier. So clearly he didn't have much of a complex about that. Now, the other interesting wrinkle here is that La Fille du Prisatier actually was banned by the Germans, but it was banned for a completely different reason than what Pagnol said. Okay, so what happens is the Germans make there's a German director called Willy Forster who makes an adaptation of Maupassant's Bel Ami. It comes out in the occupied zone in early 1941. Vichy allows it across the demarcation line in late 41, but it has lots of negative references to French decadence, sexually promiscuous French women, all sorts of things that you sort of associate with Maupassant. So Vichy censors banned the film. And they also banned the film, they banned two other films, Jude Sus and Homme Kruger, which is an anti-British film about the Boer War. They banned those two films in French North Africa. And in retaliation for that, and only in retaliation for that, did the Germans ban La Fille du Prisatier in the northern zone and another French-made film that came north called L'étrange Suzy. So that's the context in which Pagnol very selectively lied about why the film was banned. To wrap up quickly, in May of 1942, when it became apparent to Pagnol that despite renting his studios briefly to Continental, despite working with the Vichy government, he was not going to be allowed to go to Paris and make the new trilogy that he wanted without working directly for Graven and Continental. He simply gave up. He didn't have a lot invested in that project, so he simply cashed out, sold his studios and his production laboratories in Marseille to Gaumont, which continued to promote his films and collect box office receipts for him throughout the remainder of the occupation. And he and Josette, love that picture, he and Josette moved to an old windmill estate that he had in the Sarthe department near Le Mans, where he lived out the rest of the war very quietly. So Pagnol, as I said at the beginning, I think is quite an interesting case study because he sort of shows the limits of sort of situational collaboration in order to preserve one's own financial interests. Pagnol was a very smart guy. He was very cagey politically. He supported the conservative right in the 1930s. He never joined any party officially. And he clearly knew that the occupation was going to come to an end at a certain point, and he didn't want to do anything that would compromise himself long term. And as soon as he was in a position, he was no longer in a position of financial vulnerability, he washed his hands and cashed out. So that's all I have. I'm sorry for going over time. So thank you for your attention.